When the conversation about fasting and different hormetic stressors like cold therapy and even ketosis comes up, the topic of women's hormones is often left out completely. So today's guest and I are going to dive into that and so much more. So stay tuned. Welcome back. My name is Sarah. This is the Sarah Kleiner Wellness YouTube channel. Today, I have Kayla Osterhoff on the channel, and we are talking all about women's hormones, how they shift throughout a month. And don't worry if you're someone who doesn't have a monthly cycle. We also talk about how to find out where you are in that infradian rhythm, how women, even though they don't necessarily have a cycle, can pinpoint how to frame their month and when is the best time for more stressors like keto, fasting, cold therapy? When is the best time to be a bit more restorative? So, we really have all of that in this episode for you. I think you're going to find it very informative and interesting. Make sure you follow Kayla. Her information is going to be down in the show notes for you. And before we jump into the conversation, I do want to thank two quick sponsors. The first one is going to be Viva Rays. You can use my code YOGI to save 15% over at Viva Rays. Now, we talk extensively in this episode about the effect of circadian rhythms on hormone health and how that can actually help us to set the tone for our infradian rhythm, how we can actually influence that by taking control of our circadian health. So, Viva Rays is my go to source for controlling those circadian rhythms, protecting circadian rhythms. Check them out, linked in the show notes below. Second sponsor of today's episode is Optimal Carnivore. You can use my special link that's going to be down in the show notes for you to get bundle deals and special discounts on their products. I'm really loving their bone matrix product right now. It has collagen, bone matrix, and bone marrow. Fantastic for building healthy hair, bones, joints, all of those things. And I am loving it because they don't add extra liver to their formulation. I think that a lot of the organ meat companies that sell the supplements, they will add extra liver, which isn't always a good thing. So this is just the collagen and the bone marrow, these things that are really going to enhance your hair growth, bones, joints, all of these things. So check them out. That special link is down in the show notes for you. And without further ado, let's get into this conversation with Kayla. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm so excited for today's guest. We are going to talk about female brain, hormones, how all of these things really work together. And I think this is a very overlooked topic. So, Kayla, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I think this conversation is a long time coming, so I'm excited to discuss all things female biology, neurology.
Absolutely. Well, tell my listeners a little bit about your background and how you got into this kind of a niche, I guess you could call it.
Yeah. So my educational and career background is pretty standard in terms of, I took the standard course going through school, going through college, going through a master's program in public health. And then I actually spent several years working as a health scientist for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And that's actually what brought me here to Atlanta. And as I was working as a health scientist for CDC, I really faced some health challenges of my own that really opened my eyes to some issues around women's health and women's biology, and really the fact that women are not well researched and understood. So up to that point, I had, taken the health science route and research route for human health. And that included taking courses, in biology and biochemistry and chemistry and anatomy and physiology, and all the things that you would expect, right? That you take to learn about the human body and health and how everything works. But the problem was nowhere along that path. And even now, in my finishing up my doctoral degree right now in neuropsychophysiology,
Wow.
not one time along that pathway had I ever taken a single course on female biology and how female biology is different than male biology.
Wow.
And so my experience was the same as most women, which is I started facing some health challenges of my own and was completely misguided and misunderstood by the scientific community and by the medical community. And so I was unable to get the support and help that I really needed. I experienced a lot of challenges, the same ones that many other women face, due to the fact that the medical professionals who were supporting me in my health and even in my own educational journey, I was not provided the right information about my body in order to take good care of it.
Mm.
Which sounds strange, as a health scientist and working in
Mhm.
the medical field, and even at CDC, where we create the medical protocols that the rest of the world essentially uses.
Right.
None of these are informed by science that is conducted and research that is conducted on women.
Mm.
And so, because of this gap in the research and in the scientific understanding of women, we're not guided properly for our health, for our well being. We don't understand our bodies. We don't understand our basic biological needs, which are very different than our male counterparts. And as a result, we tend to experience higher levels of things like mental illness, chronic illness, and even things like autoimmune dysfunction and things like that. Women experience at a much higher rate because of the fact that they don't really understand their feminine needs that are unique to them versus what is taught, which is very male centric.
Absolutely. So what kind of issues were you going through at the time where you realized like, all right, this is obviously doesn't apply to me, or it's it's like fitting a square peg into a round hole?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm sure you probably relate to this and many of the women listening, but at the time I was kind of juggling a lot of things and wearing many hats. I was full time working at CDC. I was also starting my doctoral studies at the same time, and I was training with Team USA as a duathlete.
Wow.
And so there was really no spare time in the day. Everything was really regimented for me. And as a result, because I had to, be focused and be at my peak physical endurance and strength all of the time, I had to eat perfectly and train perfectly and sleep really well and track all these metrics and take a million supplements and, do special diets and all this stuff, right? However, none of that was tailored to my specific needs as a woman. And so as a result, I burned out big time, like crashed and burned out.
Mhm.
I started working with a functional doctor, and we did a bazillion tests, and I spent probably over 100 grand on, trying to fix my health. However, even with all of the lab testing and working with a functional doctor and working with a naturopath and a chiropractor and a physical therapist and all this stuff, none of us could figure out, how to really heal me. And what we knew was that I was completely burned out. My adrenals were burned out, cortisol had flatlined. And then downstream, what I learned, when your cortisol and your blood sugar is mismanaged, which mine was because of stress, it also ends up burning out your female hormones. And
Mhm.
so at that time, my functional doctor told me that I had the hormones of a 90-year-old woman,
Wow.
and that it was going to be really hard for me to function at a normal level if I didn't take care of it. However, she, even though she was a great doctor, was unable to guide me in the right way because she was also missing some key pieces about female biology that I now know, because of going through my own journey and then focusing my research and my career on studying women.
Wow. Yeah, I feel like that's so common and it's what I talk about it constantly because a lot of the women and people that listen to the podcast are kind of in this, we want to biohack our health. We want to do the intermittent fasting and coffee and fasted workouts and, keto all the time or carnivore all the time, ice bathing, like all the things that are like, preached as they're going to help you lose weight, they're going to help you feel better. And what ends up happening is that these hormones end up being in this chronic, like low state.
Yes.
So, my question is, how did you bring yourself out of that chronically low hormonal state? And I've been there myself too. I talk about it all the time, and I'd love to hear about your journey of how you brought yourself out and made those connections.
Yeah. So, like I said, I kind of started diving into women's health and the research on female biology and trying to understand what was going on with my own body. Because from everything I had learned to that point and from all the guidance from my medical doctors and other scientists, I was doing everything perfect and to the book. And I should have been in perfect physical shape. Um, However, we know that that was not the case. So, um, over several years after that, I started kind of collecting little bits about female biology and these major findings in just handfuls of research, which is really all that there is in terms of what research actually includes women and looks at female biology, and how things are different. And so by collecting those bits and then starting to do my own research and then experimenting on my own body, I had this aha moment, a couple years after that. And that was that one, which seems obvious, that men and women are very, very biologically different. We have completely different biological needs. And the basis for that was kind of the big aha moment, which is a timing thing. The
Mm,
biggest difference is that the timing of the female biology and the timing of the male biology is very, very different. We're set to this different kind of biological clock, or what I call the biorhythm. So the male biorhythm is the one that we understand as a society at large, and it's the one that we operate on as a society as at large. And that makes a lot of sense because the research that we have and the data that we have is extremely male centric. So, as a result, we understand how the male body works, we understand how to properly support it, and we develop systems and infrastructures and societal expectations that align with that biological rhythm, which is the only one that we study and teach currently. Now, that biological rhythm is a 24-hour repeating
mhm,
system, and it's set to the pace of the adrenals. And so our sleep wake hormones, which are cortisol and melatonin. So, cortisol, as we were talking about before, of course, is the stress hormone, but it's also our waking hormone.
mhm.
So, it's the thing that we need in order to wake up, stay alert, and go throughout the day. It's a necessary piece of our circadian rhythm, right? Melatonin is what is produced at night, and it helps us to prepare for sleep, get to sleep, stay asleep, and it has a lot of neurological benefits related to that. So that is a 24-hour system that repeats every day, right? That men and women both have. But the difference is that the male biology at large, or the male physiology, is set to the pace of that 24-hour system. So we're talking the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, the nervous system, the brain, the metabolism, the immune system, the neuroendocrine system, all of these things, right? All of the parts that men and women share globally are set to the pace in men of this 24-hour repeating system. So, as a result, the male biology and physiology operates consistently day in and day out with just really small changes over really long periods of time, just like women as well. You know, as we age, there are little shifts that happen over long periods of time. But in general, from day to day, the male biology and physiology is standard. It's the same. It just repeats on a repeating clock. Now, this also contributes to the fact why we study men almost exclusively,
Mhm.
because their biology is more simple. It's reliable. It repeats. Now, for women, we're a lot more complex, which we probably can all understand right off the
Mhm.
get-go is,
Mhm.
yeah, there's a lot more moving parts going on. For women, we have a very different biological rhythm that is set to the pace of our ovarian hormones.
Yes.
So what that means is that we have a all those global physiological systems are set to the pace of these two hormones, which ebb and flow over the course of a month. So instead of having a 24-hour repeating system, we have a 28-day-ish repeating system. And little by little, women are different every day, and we are significantly physiologically different 4 times a month as we go through 4 significant hormonal changes in terms of those ovarian hormones over the course of a month. So, again, kind of relating this back to where women are, why we're misunderstood, why we're not researched. Women are complex. There's a lot of moving parts going on. We have a month-long biological rhythm, and essentially we're 4 different people over the course of a month, which means that if we're being researched, we have to take that into account, and we actually have to control for that. And essentially, we have 4 subjects for every one woman, if the research is being done properly, which even when women are included, only sometimes is it being done properly to control for those changes. So that was kind of my big aha discovery moment. And since then, it's been a beautiful evolution of being able to understand my female biological rhythm and be able to align my lifestyle and health practices and training and workflow and cognitive skills and abilities with the different phases and versions of me that occur every single month. And that is what healed my hormones. When I understood that my basic biological needs actually change significantly 4 times a month, and I understood that I have to have 4 different routines, 4 different environments, 4 different support systems, 4 different working schedules, then my body was able to kind of heal itself, and it got into a natural rhythm, which eventually healed my hormones and my adrenals and got back to normal.
Wow, that's amazing. And I think some women listening to this might ask the question right off, well, how does this also apply to women who don't have a monthly cycle anymore? So maybe
Yes.
yeah, I was going to ask about that. So yes,
Yeah,
they do.
absolutely. So one of the things that is a huge reality in our society is that um, a huge portion of women don't have a normal cycle
Right.
for lots of different reasons. It could be natural reasons, meaning that they've gone through menopause and they're on the other side of that, or it could be because they're on hormonal birth control,
Hmm.
or it could be because they have gotten pregnant and their period hasn't come back naturally after that. Or it could be because they have metabolic dysfunction, or they could be underweight. So there's a million reasons
Hmm.
why a woman can lose her period, right? Or not have a normal cycle.
Yeah.
This is the reality in our society. And so when we talk about women who have a normal cycle, which is when we're looking at women's health topics, the assumption is that women have a normal cycle, right? But that's not the case for
It's
probably the majority.
right.
Yeah. However, what is cool and what we are starting to understand about the female biological rhythm is that whether or not a woman has a period, she still has about a month long biological rhythm where the physiology changes and the everything ebbs and flows in terms of all those other systems. So even if the hormones, for instance, of estrogen and progesterone may not be ebbing and flowing as they used to during the actively cycling years, so postmenopausally, women still report having a month-long biological rhythm where their energy levels ebb and flow, where their
Hmm.
cognitive capacities ebb and flow, where their metabolism changes and things are different, right? Um, so what's really cool about that is even though we don't have the data and the research to say these are the mechanisms of why that is the case, what we do know is that this still exists. And what my kind of theory on that is that because women go through the vast majority of their lives with this cycle, and which regulates their entire physiology, that postmenopausally, even though the ebb and flow of those hormones, which were the pacemaker of that biological rhythm for a long time, even though the pacemaker stops ticking, you could say, over the course of a month, the physiology still remembers how to operate that way. And so it still goes on. Um, So this brings up a question of, okay, what if I'm postmenopausal and I don't have a period, or if I don't have a period for whatever other reason, maybe one
Yeah,
of the,
I'm breastfeeding right now. Like
yeah,
6 months in, I'm like,
yes,
okay,
yeah.
guess this is not coming back until I'm done breastfeeding.
Yeah, so whether or not you have a period, you still have a female biological rhythm, which will
Mhm.
be about a month long. Every woman's going to be a little different. And, as you go through different life phases, this can like stretch or compress a little, but on average, it's about a month long. And you will go through these ebbs and flows in the physiology. So then it becomes a question of, well, how do I know where I am if I don't have a period to understand, I'm in phase one, for instance, which
Mhm.
would be when you have menstruation. So there are different ways to kind of figure that out, but it all starts with really understanding what those ebbs and flows in the physiology are, so that you can be like, oh, okay, yeah, I do experience this at this time and I experience this at this time, and you can start to map it out and figure out where you are. I have a whole process for this, but just to simplify it, I can explain, the basic physiology of the four phases, and
Yeah.
then we can start to kind of go through ideas, maybe even with you, to figure out, okay, where might you be in that cycle, and then how you can kind of track that and start to align with it moving forward.
Awesome. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'd love to hear about that because what I
yeah,
usually tell women and kind of what I do is go by new moon would be like the
yes,
bleed date, and then full moon would be like ovulation time because
yeah,
that's when I actually got my circadian rhythms down and got
yeah,
really strict with my circadian health and blocking blue light at night. That happened
yes.
naturally for me, and I ended up conceiving my son on the full moon,
Oh,
and then he was actually born on full moon also. So
oh
he's
my gosh.
like super synced up, and that's how my
Yeah,
cycles ended up being as well. And that's what
yeah,
I tell women that are menopausal, women that are kind of have
yes,
amenorrhea, these types of things. That's what I say, but I would love to hear from a
yeah,
more scientific perspective
yeah.
how you figure that out and how you go. Yeah.
Yeah, so that is a really good tool. Um, and it's a little esoteric, and we
Yep.
can't really explain why that happens. Why do women's cycles align with the moon phases and all of that? We can't explain that scientifically, but we know that that is the case for about 70% of women. They will align with the moon phases, and sometimes it can be flip-flopped. So
Mhm.
the new moon versus the full moon can either be menstruation or ovulation, and it can flip for different women. But for the other 30% of women, it doesn't match up. And most likely the reason why is because of endocrine disruptors or dysfunction with our circadian rhythm and sleep, or some metabolic issues, usually some kind of lifestyle factors that take us out of a natural rhythm, and put us into a different kind of rhythm. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It just makes it a little more hard to figure out where you are and how to navigate. Um, so I'll just give like a really brief overview of the physiology, and that aspect of the four phases, just to give the women listening an understanding of, where you might be and how things are really significantly changing for you in each of these phases. So, phase one, or the menstrual phase, is what we could call it in terms of the ovulatory cycle phases. This is just about the first week of the female biorhythm. And when I talk about the female biorhythm, I'm not just talking about the menstrual cycle, I'm talking about the global physiology. So, all of those other systems that I mentioned that are regulated or set to a pace of the ovarian hormones. So at this phase, hormonally, this is when estrogen and progesterone are at their very lowest level. At the same time, there are some metabolic and neurological shifts that are really important. And I'll just give a kind of a couple examples of each. So, when estrogen and progesterone are at their lowest level, the female metabolic activity slows down. So there's kind of like a global downshift of the female physiology and certain systems. What I mean by that is that the conversion of food into fuel, or the conversion of macros, so fats, carbs, and proteins, converted through the citric acid cycle, ending in ATP, which is fuel for the cells. That whole process slows down with this low hormonal state.
Do you
At the
see a
same
slowdown kind of like in the mitochondria, the respiratory proteins maybe going further apart or swelling a little bit?
Yeah, there is not any research to look at what's actually happening with mitochondrial function, but what we do know is there's less ATP produced, and that
Mm,
whole process slows. So there's actually less fuel availability for the body.
mm.
Um, so the body naturally feels less energetic, or women feel less energetic during this time. That is actually normal, natural, and it's supposed to happen. And the way that I like to think about this is in terms of resources. So if we think about the resources that we have available in phase one, we see that we have less ATP production, less energy metabolic conversion. So not just ATP, but the actual conversions going through glycolysis and protein
Mhm.
synthesis and lipid metabolism. All of that kind of slows down in this very low hormonal phase at the beginning.
I hope you're enjoying today's episode with Kayla. As a reminder, all of her information is down in the show notes for you. And I want to thank one more sponsor of today's episode. That is going to be Upgraded Formulas. This is my go to source for understanding the mineral balance within your body. A blood test is only going to tell you what is going on right now, kind of an acute situation. A hair tissue mineral analysis will give you a picture of what's been going on over the last 60 to 90 days in your body. And having a consultation will help you to drill down so that you're not just guessing when it comes to mineral balance. Now, most of us do have some sort of a mineral balance, and just adding in exogenous minerals can actually make the problem worse. So use my code YOGI12 or Yogi if you've already used that one before to save over at Upgraded Formulas to really get to the bottom of your minerals. And without further ado, let's get back into the episode with Kayla.
Also, what happens is we see a neurological shift. Not
Mm,
only does the chemical activity of the female brain change in each phase with each hormonal shift, but also the electrical activity of the female brain
mm,
changes too. So, cognitively, we are actually different people throughout the month, as well as physiologically. So, what happens in this low hormonal phase is that the excitatory and mood boosting neurotransmitters have a slower activity. So, this is epinephrine, norepinephrine, glutamate, serotonin, and dopamine, things like that. So, these types of neurotransmitters are also slowing in their activity. So, this can sometimes feel for women like less focus, less mental energy. Sometimes it can show up as brain fog, even though it's not necessarily brain fog, or it doesn't have to be experienced that way, but sometimes it is if there's other hormonal dysfunction going on. So at this time, as I mentioned, there's kind of this global physiological downshift. So there's less activity of the excitatory and mood boosting neurotransmitters, and there is a slowing of metabolic activity. So energy levels are lower, mood is naturally lower, and mental energy, so kind of like outward focused energy, is also less. Now,
mhm.
even though that sounds like a bummer, right? We're kind of like, why do we have to go through this phase? I don't want to be low energy, and I don't want to have lower mood, and I don't want to have brain fog. However, each phase has a purpose, and each phase has its own requirements, and each phase also has its own cognitive, what I call superpower. So, in phase one, the cognitive superpower is a woman's ability to be discerning or make decisions. It's a woman's intuitive insight. These kind of cognitive capacities are heightened specifically in phase one, which is really interesting if you reflect on that, how kind of perfect the female physiology is planned out, because our body is slowing us down, giving us less energy. It's taking our outward focus and kind of forcing it inward. It's also taking our mood and subduing it. So we may be less likely to want to interact with other people. We may want to have more solo time. And it's actually perfect because it is aligning us with our cognitive skills that are heightened during this phase of decision making, assessment, intuitive insight, forecasting, just the ability to know things. Um, and at the same time, our requirement for self care and our need to allocate our resources, which are a little more limited during this time, in a smart way, is so much more important, which also aligns with those cognitive capacities. So going from phase one into phase two, this is when estrogen kind of takes the stage and becomes
Mhm.
the star player. And in this phase, estrogen is rising to a peak. And as estrogen rises to a peak, the metabolic activity within our body, so that ATP production and the conversion of our food into fuel for our body and for our brain, is starts to ramp up as estrogen rises. At the same time, those excitatory and mood boosting neurotransmitters also ramp up in their activity. So, as a result, women start to feel more energetic, they start to have more focus, and physically, they have more power, strength, and endurance. What happens cognitively during this time is that there's a shift in a woman's ability to navigate, which is pretty cool because with heightened navigational skill, a woman can take those decisions or plans that she made in phase one with that more introspective viewpoint and more intuitive insight ability to kind of assess the situation. She's able to take that information and actually put it into action and navigate with it. At the same
Wow.
time, a woman's emotional intelligence increases as estrogen increases, which is really interesting because that also means that our ability to communicate and connect with others and have empathy about others' situations and compassion is heightened, which are amazing leadership skills and qualities. So, if you think about it, it's kind of like this perfect progression that starts to come back into place where phase one, you're doing the internal work, you're taking care of yourself, you're making sure you take care of your resources and putting them in the right places in a smart way instead of burning through them. You are making your decisions for the rest of the month and putting your plans in place. Then in phase two, you are feeling like you have more energy and the ability to carry out these plans, and you're able to work with your teams and communicate with other people and build and navigate. And then in phase three, this is the ovulatory phase, which, as you mentioned, most often for women aligns with the full moon.
Mhm.
Um, this is when women feel their very best. And this is actually what I call the bloom phase because women usually have the most energy. They also have the highest power, strength, and endurance. They have the highest mood. They have the highest emotional intelligence, and they are very charismatic or magnetic, you could call it. So this charismatic quality or ability to be more influential is the cognitive superpower of women in this phase.
Mm.
So this is a perfect time for women to be taking advantage of the ability to have more influence. This is when they might want to do their pitches or their social interactions, strategic partnerships, networking events. This is a really good time to leverage those things as we are our best communicators and we have the most ability to connect and understand other people's emotions and our own, and we have all this energy to do it all essentially. Now, these phase two and phase three is usually the points at which women feel their best, and that's usually how we align our lives. And those are the expectations that we hold of ourselves. Is that rock star woman that we are in those times? That's the woman we expect ourselves to be all the time. And then when we're not, we beat ourselves up, and we certainly don't take care of our needs as they shift away from those two awesome phases. But as we learn about our physiology, all the phases become awesome because we can really tap into different skill sets and use our resources in a smart way once we understand how they shift. So going from the ovulatory phase into the luteal phase, which is the whole back half of the female hormone cycle, or the final 2 weeks. So, phase one was week one, phase two is week two, phase three is really short, 1 to 3 days, and it's the
Hmm.
shift between the first half and the back half. The back half is the luteal phase in terms of the ovulatory cycle. That's what it's called. But I call this the grow phase in terms of the female biological rhythm, because of what happens for a woman that is really kind of focused on growth and adaptation and learning. So, in this back half, the estrogen is kind of coming down the other side of the peak. There's a little bit of a boost in the middle, but mostly it's slowly, progressively declining until we get back to menstruation again, where it's at its lowest point again. So, as that's happening, our energy levels start to diminish little by little. The first week of the luteal phase, we still usually have pretty good energy levels. The final week of the luteal phase, we've noticed a difference in energy levels and in our mood and in our mental focus. However, progesterone now takes the stage. So progesterone rises to a peak during this phase and is pretty high during this entire phase. As progesterone rises to a peak, it creates these shifts in our physiology that are different from the first half, but also have its own benefits. So, just for instance, when estrogen rises to a peak, so does a couple of interesting neurochemicals that change a woman's cognitive function, and it also changes the way that her nervous system functions for her as well. So, as estrogen rises to a peak, so does a chemical called brain derived neurotrophic factor,
Hmm.
or BDNF, which increases neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. So, a woman's ability to learn and adapt to a situation, to learn new things, to grow, is heightened because those neural pathways are more plastic or more malleable. At the same time, she's actually growing new neurons at a higher rate during this phase, which is really cool, also,
Hmm.
especially because just about 5 years ago, we as a society didn't think that new neurons were possible in adult humans. And now we know, of course, that's possible and it's happening all the time. But for women, especially, it's happening at a higher rate for the whole final 2 weeks of our cycle, which is really cool. At the same time, there's a boost in our down regulatory neurotransmitter, and that is our GABA neurotransmitter. So, a stark contrast to the front half, where we had those excitatory and mood boosting neurotransmitters rising to a peak. Now that's coming back down the other side as our down regulatory neurotransmitter of GABA takes the stage and becomes more prominent in its activity. So, what GABA does is a couple of things. It helps our nervous system to down regulate, but it also helps us to get restful quality sleep and stay asleep, as well as neural pruning and memory consolidation.
Hmm.
So, a woman's ability to get more restful sleep is actually heightened during this time, and the neurological benefits of sleep are also heightened during this time. And um, her memory consolidation and neural pruning, so kind of this cleanup that happens in your brain at night, is happening at a higher rate. But there is kind of a caveat to that, because at the same time, the nervous system has shifted to have more of a sympathetic dominance as estrogen is decreasing.
Ah.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword, and you have to walk this fine line of being able to reap the benefits while also being in consideration of this other neurological shift that makes us a little more sensitive to stress. So, this is a big thing because women aren't taught that their capacity for stress or their stress thresholds change throughout the month, meaning that the amount of stress that we can withstand in a healthy way. It changes. So during this phase, it's lower. The amount of stress that we can process and handle or put into our stress bucket is less because our stress bucket is shrinking. And
Hmm.
then in the front half, our stress bucket increases as estrogen rises, and then it kind of decreases. So middle of the biorhythm, we have our highest capacity for stress. At the same time, we have our most energy levels. At the same time, we have this heightened mood and focus. And at the same time, we have our most power, strength, and endurance. And then it starts to decrease, which means that our need for self care is heightened. Our need to really take care of our nervous system and manage our stress, it becomes more and more important. But so few of us are doing that because we're operating at phase 2 or 3 and we're staying there. Even
Mm-hmm.
though our body is changing and our biological needs are changing. And then we wonder, why am I burning out? That was
Mm-hmm.
my story. I stayed at phase 3 24/7, obviously not sustainable or even possible, but I
Right.
forced myself to stay at this high level of performance every single day that my body was only capable of in one phase. And then I bypassed those cognitive superpowers and all the beautiful things that happen in the other phases because I was forcing myself to stay in this one phase, by drinking tons of coffee and taking
Mm-hmm.
nootropics and pushing through, right? How many times have we told ourselves or everyone else around us, oh, I'll just push through, don't worry about it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we shouldn't just push through. We should actually go with the ebb and flow of our body and go with the river because we're much more productive and we're much more, we function at a higher level when we can do that. And then our bodies don't get burned out.
Exactly. Or we don't lose all of those hormones that are supposed to kind of ebb
Yes.
and flow to begin with. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So symptoms that a woman might have gotten to that burnout phase would maybe be feeling flat, feeling tired, tired but wired. Are there any
Yes.
other symptoms that come to mind that you think of?
Oh, yeah. So, big crashes in
Mhm.
energy, especially around food, that's a big sign. So, like, if you eat something and you have an immediate crash of energy soon after that, that's a big thing. Skin issues. I had
Mhm.
crazy skin issues at the same time, hair falling out, brain fog is a big one, weight gain or loss that is unsustainable, so kind of these fluctuations in weight. Um, these are all kind of the big symptoms and the ones that women most often experience. And then they write off as, oh, these are PMS, right?
Right.
Or they say, oh, I've gone through the change in my life. So it's just, I'm going to be hormonal, right? Um, but the fact is that every human is always hormonal. And if we weren't, we would be dead because hormones regulate everything in our body.
Right.
But we want those to be at a healthy place by understanding how, as they change, we need to take care of our bodies differently.
Exactly. So for women, I think you mentioned that you have this kind of infradian rhythm, whether or not you have a cycle present or don't. I mentioned the kind of moon phasing, looking at that. What are some other ways that they could kind of figure out where they were? Would they just go by how they feel? Like, and especially if they're already in this burned out, kind of like done phase,
Yeah.
how could someone actually, if they're in that place,
Yeah.
figure out where in the cycle that they are?
Yeah, so kind of reflecting on the 4 phases and what I explained, how some of these changes occur. Every woman will still experience some level of that. And usually, the phase that we can identify the easiest is that phase 3 area, where for a couple of days or maybe even a couple of weeks, depending on the woman, we feel pretty good in terms of we can handle our workload and we can handle the stressors in life and we can do more and we can work out how we like to work out and we can stay up later and feel okay the next day, all of these things. So usually I direct women to try to identify that point. So even in my worst burnout uh, phase of my life, I still had little changes that I could track. And so I was able to identify, okay, I feel good today. And so that was a sign that I was somewhere around phase 3. Um, and for me, that didn't last long because my hormones were pretty burned out, as well as my adrenals. But there were a couple of days in the month where I did feel better than other days generally. And later I found I was able to map it. And then later my period came back and I was able to see that that was phase three. So I would try to identify that. The other one that's easier to identify is when when you might feel your worst, especially if the hormones are dysregulated. I also want to mention that none of these phases, you don't have to feel bad in any of these phases. You can
Mhm.
feel like you have energy and stamina, and you can do all the things that you want to do in every phase if you're able to adjust and take care of yourself the way that you need to take care of yourself. However, if there is hormonal dysfunction going on or adrenal burnout going on, you will likely feel pretty bad in phase one or
Mm.
somewhere around phase one. End of phase three, beginning of phase one, because it's not a line, right? It's a circle.
Right.
So next
Yep.
step. So end of phase four, beginning of phase one, that would be usually when women are feeling their worst if they are having some issues. So if you can identify one of those, then you can start to kind of count the days in between, and then you can start to kind of map it. And every woman's going to have a different biorhythm, whether it be, 28 days, 32 days, 24 days, it'll be different. But it should be pretty consistent because changes in the length of the biorhythm are slow changes over long periods of time. The biorhythm doesn't change from one month to the next month. It's pretty consistent, even if the period might move around. So that's the other thing, is that the period might not be a reliable tracking method, especially for women who are going through perimenopause, where they
Mhm.
may have one period and then they don't have another one for 3 months, or they have a period and then they have spotting for like a whole month and then they can't tell if they have another period or not, right? So that can make it hard. So I like to use the easier metrics to track that are like energy levels. There are other things that go deeper into kind of these physiological changes in terms of metabolism and how fats and proteins and carbs are metabolized, and these other metrics that can be used with the nervous system too.
Mhm.
But one that any woman can really understand is energy levels. And that's the one that we're usually the most concerned about so that we can do everything that we have put on our plate. So if women can start tracking their energy levels, and they could just do a rating system of 1 to 10 and start tracking every day and just reflect back, do it for a month and reflect back and see if there were a few days where the energy level was significantly higher and a few days where the energy level was significantly lower, and you can pretty well map your biorhythm onto that.
Mm. Interesting. So always you're going to be in phase 3 when you have the most energy, which would kind of be like your ovulation time, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
Unless there, I mean, of course, there can be lifestyle factors where something can
Sure.
shift.
Sure.
And so there could, if you have some major thing happen in your life, you may not feel phase three like you normally would. So, of course, there are caveats to it. But generally, you will see a shift, even if it's not a big one. You'll see this pattern of there is a up and down, there's an ebb and flow.
Hmm. And so when we look at this whole, like 4 phase of the cycle for women, when are the best times? And I kind of have my ideas about this, but what would you say are the best times for more exercise, like types of exercise around different phases of the month? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'll expand this out to kind of any health or biohacking routine. You mentioned a whole bunch at the beginning of our talk that
Mhm.
were really relevant to the different needs of women. So exercise is one, diets are another thing. Um, our stress management, doing things like cold exposure, keto diet, fasting, red light therapy, all of these different things that we do for our health really need to be done in different ways in each phase. Diet and exercise are like the most obvious and also have kind of the biggest impact, because women really should be eating differently in every phase to, one, feed their hormones and optimize their hormones, what they need for each phase, um, and two, to adjust to the metabolic shifts. So there's an overall shift in caloric need, but there's also shifts in the amounts of each of the macros that are needed in each phase. There's also shifts in different micronutrients that are needed in each phase, which is a whole other way longer conversation. But what I want women to know is there is no one diet that is going to work for you,
Mhm.
because we should not be eating in one standard way every day of the month. We should be eating in an ebb and flow with what our body needs. Same thing with exercise. So, with exercise, our capacity for different types of exercise also shifts. This goes along with the metabolic shifts that happen, and the energy levels, but it also has to do with our musculoskeletal system and how our muscles are built, and how, for instance, protein is synthesized, and how we get energy for our muscles and for our body to move. So as those shifts happen, we really need to understand how to exercise differently. So, just for example, in the highest estrogen phase, or as estrogen is even rising, as I mentioned before, women have more physical power, strength, and endurance. So, doing more type of endurance training, cardio training, and even like HIIT type workouts, high intensity interval training, those kinds of exercises are really supportive for women during that time, especially because we have these higher energy levels and we actually need to use it. We need to burn those or burn that extra energy and that extra fuel that we have. We want to utilize it. So it is good to work out in that way during those times. And oftentimes women try to work out like that all the time.
Mhm.
Um, or they say, 3 times a week, I'm going to run 5 miles or 10 miles. And then 2 times a week, I'm going to lift heavy weights.
Mhm.
Well, there's actually a timing when heavy weights are going to be more productive and supportive, and when running or cardio or bike riding, things like that, are going to be more productive for us. And then there are times when we need to really focus more on recovery. So these are the obvious phases. This is at the end of phase 4 and beginning of phase 1, when, first of all, our nervous system is has more of this sympathetic quality. So our
Mhm.
stress bucket, or our capacity for stress, is lower. So that includes positive forms of stress like exercise.
Mm.
So even though exercise is typically a positive form of stress, or what is called a form of eustress, it can be a form of distress if our stress bucket is already full,
Yep.
because anything past that capacity becomes distress, even if it's a positive stressor. So, heavy, like high intensity exercise during this phase is usually not going to be the best option, because our nervous system really can't handle it. Also, our metabolism is downshifting during this time. So we don't have the same amount of fuel for those types of exercises. But we can still do functional types of exercise and really ramp up the kind of restorative types of exercise that will actually give us more benefit to the more endurance or high intensity or weight training that we've done in other phases.
Mm. Got it. So you'd probably want to do more weight training, maybe more hit training when estrogen is a little bit higher, would you say?
Mhm. Yeah, typically. And again, there's more nuance in terms of how the macros are metabolized and what's
Mhm.
being fed to the muscles and all of that. But in general, the high intensity or cardiovascular types of workouts that are more high intensity or endurance training is better at the higher estrogen phases. So phases 2 and 3. And then towards the end of phase 4 and beginning of phase 1, more restorative type practices and functional movements are good too. So, stretching, body weight type exercises, even just making sure you get better rest and better sleep so that your muscles can recover.
Mm, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the food is kind of the same thing too, where you can be a little bit more, I don't want to say restrictive, but you can get away with eating a little bit less
Yes.
carbohydrate at certain times of the month. And then I always tell people like that last part of the cycle is not a time to do a lot of fasting. It's not
Right.
a lot of time to, push yourself and have coffee for breakfast, those sorts of things, because you can really push yourself into a low hormonal situation, right?
Yes, exactly. So, just for instance, with the coffee, so coffee increases cortisol.
Hmm.
And when you increase cortisol, it dysregulates your blood sugar. So it can
Hmm.
actually spike your blood sugar. So you have kind of two things going against you at that time. And then at the same time, you have this parasympathetic dominance. So your stress
Hmm.
capacity is lower, but you have more cortisol. So then the cortisol begins to steal and take away what your hormones will need and also kind of steal away from your energy, which is also lower at that point. So it's kind of like this quadruple edged sword where you're kind of really hitting it at all. You're causing more further dysregulation at all ends just by this one thing that you think you're doing to support yourself, which is drink more coffee so you can have more energy. But the down stream dysregulation that is caused by something like that over a long period of time is significant. And it's the same with heavy exercise at a time when your body just doesn't have the capacity for that. And it's the same thing with things that like extreme types of biohacks, like cold thermogenesis, for
Hmm.
instance. Cold exposure is great to train the nervous system and help you to be more resilient. However, if your nervous system cannot handle that
Right.
kind of stress at that time, you are further dysregulating your nervous system and causing more sympathetic tone to it. And of course, you're increasing cortisol at a time when your body can't handle it, which can downregulate your female hormones and your insulin regulation. It's kind of this whole um, disaster situation that starts to spiral out of control after many, many cycles of doing it that way. So, things like that are also more appropriate during a time when your nervous system can handle that type of training. So, in the higher estrogen phases, are when your nervous system is going to have a little more capacity, more parasympathetic quality, and be able to handle more stress, which things like cold exposure is a form of stress, even though just like exercise, it's a form of positive stress,
Hmm.
usually. But it can be distress if not applied at the right times.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, really, the key to balancing the hormones is getting yourself back in sync with this infradian rhythm and respecting that as it comes to as a whole, right?
Yeah. Yeah, just understanding that even though we get pressure by society to operate at a level and maintain it that way, and we're told from a very young age that consistency is the key to success.
Hmm.
And we're also taught by our favorite biohackers out there that cold thermogenesis is the thing that's going to help you to regulate your nervous system, and keto
Right.
diet is going to help you to lose weight and maintain mental energy, and low carb diet is the best for everyone, and
Right.
intermittent fasting is the best way to have a lot of energy and regulate your metabolism. Well, yes, for men. All of that is true for men. And that is what the research shows because the
Right.
research is done on male bodies. So it
Right.
all makes sense. However, if we study those same things on a group of women, you will find that all of those things cause dysregulation and dysfunction, especially have a negative hormonal impact if not applied at the right timing. So all of
Exactly.
those things are beneficial for women at the right time and not beneficial at the wrong time.
Agree 100%. Yeah, that's what I always say. Like, these things are great, but you have to do them with nuance for your
Yes,
cycle. Like,
yes,
keto can be really helpful to help you to regulate hormones if you have insulin resistance or
yeah,
PCOS or, one of these conditions. But you have to be respectful of how your hormones are shifting
yes,
on that the cyclical basis.
yeah.
And I've done a little bit of research. I don't know if you have looked at this in any of your work, but our hormones seem to be different in the summer than they are in the winter. Have you looked at that research at all?
I have looked at it a little bit, which makes sense. And again, this is kind of going a little more into the esoteric of how women's bodies align with the moon phases. Women's bodies also align with the
Seasons.
phases of of the earth, yeah, the
Mhm.
seasons. But that is not a female centric quality.
Right.
Men have the same thing.
Yeah.
So, men and women both have metabolic, energetic changes that flow with the seasons.
Hmm.
But even so, within those changes, women still have the month long ebb and flow.
Hmm. Yep.
So, yeah, energy levels may be even higher, for instance, in phase three during the summer than they would
Hmm.
be in the winter,
Yeah.
which makes a lot of sense because our circadian rhythms as humans align with with the sun and the moon. And when the days are longer, we require more energy. So naturally, our bodies are going to adjust for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then I guess one last question. How do you see this, or do you see kind of this infradian rhythm still happening with a woman who is going through pregnancy, or what kind of
Hmm.
things do you see in that?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one. And um, so this kind of goes back to that research issue or that research gap where
Yeah,
women
you
are not
can't
studied,
research
right?
pregnancy. Yeah.
Yeah, so women are barely studied in general because they
Hmm.
make very difficult and risky research subjects because they can potentially become pregnant, but also because they have all these moving parts and it's really hard to
Hmm.
study them. So we don't even study women in general. Very few of us do. And when we do study women, there are certain protected populations, including pregnant women and breastfeeding women, that we cannot study.
Yep.
It's very, very difficult to study pregnant and breastfeeding women. And when we do study them, it's usually has something to do specifically with reproductive health or the health of the child. It's not really looking at the general biological functions of pregnant women versus non-pregnant women, which would be super interesting. And I would love to do it if, the IRB would approve human subjects research on something like that, which most likely they wouldn't because it's not something they are not studying something that's, life threatening.
Yep.
Or that they would consider to have uh, really impactful results for women, even though it would be extremely impactful. So my answer for that is I don't know.
Yep.
With pregnant women, it's hard because you can tell them, for instance, about the moon phases, and some pregnant women that I have worked with and interact with have said that they still feel aligned with the moon phases, even though they're pregnant. And then it's probably about 50-50. Half of them say, yeah, or they feel aligned with what their cycle was prior to pregnancy. And then the other half don't feel that. They feel more steady.
Mhm.
They
That's
don't
how I
feel
felt probably. Yeah.
yeah, they don't feel these ebbs and flows. So I'm not sure exactly how that looks in terms I mean, we know what it looks like hormonally. We
Right.
know that we go into this really high estrogen state, and then post pregnancy during breastfeeding, a really high progesterone state. But the female hormones are much higher, and they kind of just stay that way through
Hmm.
pregnancy and breastfeeding. So there isn't this ebb and flow. But I don't know if that changes the physiological ebb and flow temporarily during that time, or if it kind of stays in this cyclic pattern, but because of what else is going on, there's more dominant tone of these other states. So it's an interesting question. And pregnant women, breastfeeding women, and also postmenopausal women, I would love to see a lot more research to really understand the mechanisms behind how their physiology operates during these phases of life.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to see
Yeah,
that for
yeah,
sure. Because yeah, that's I especially get the most feedback from the postmenopausal women. They kind of feel like they've been totally written off and
yes,
forgotten about. And so that when I'm working with a postmenopausal woman, as I have a lot of them, and perimenopausal women
yeah,
too, I think I love your, I'm going to start using that. Like, look at the time when you have the most energy as like your phase 3. But I think also just kind of timing it with moon cycles can be just a good way to help them understand that they still do have that ebb and flow of energy and mood and all of those things, and to be respectful, because so many people say, oh, once you get into menopause you can just like fast and keto and cold exposure
no,
as much as you want. And I'm like, no, because you're actually, I think, more sensitive in those times, because
yeah,
your ovaries are trying, your adrenals are trying to do the work of the adrenals,
yes,
right?
yes,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So, as you go through perimenopause and menopause, you're exactly right. The ovarian hormones are trying to pass on the baton to the adrenals. But it doesn't mean that women then turn into men, because we
Right.
still have higher levels of estrogen and progesterone throughout the rest of our life that we have to work to maintain. And our physiology is still shifting.
Mm-hmm.
So our metabolic activity still shifts and our neurological activity shifts. And so we still do have to account for those things, but the shifts may be more subtle than they were when you were actively cycling at a regular pace.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Awesome. Well, this has been really, really interesting. And I know that my female viewers are really going to enjoy this.
Mm.
Where could people find you if they want to learn more about your work and what you do?
Yeah. So if you go to herbiorhythm.com, there's a lot more information about the female biorhythm and the science behind all of this. There are some online programs, but I also offer a lot of free classes and free information and content through my email as well. So you can hop on the email list there. And then you can also connect with me on Instagram or social media, which is at biocurious_Kayla.
Awesome. Well, I'll make sure to link all of that in the show notes for everybody who's listening or watching. And thank you so much. This has been really, really, really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
I've enjoyed it very much so.